The elections are over, and while the votes are still being counted in some districts, and a runoff election will be held in Georgia to determine the winner of a U.S. Senate seat in early December, it's a good time, we thought, to review the results both statewide and nationally. And for that, we're pleased to have back in our virtual studio Professor Matthew Dickinson, who teaches political science at Middlebury College. Professor Dickinson is well known locally for his talks at the Green Mountain Academy of Lifelong Learning, most recently back last September, and we were able to have him on for a discussion about the election back in early October. With the elections now over, we thought it was a good moment to hear Professor Dickinson's takeaways of the results and what those might imply in the political arena going forward.
I guess let me just start then with asking you the basic question. I guess what are your general thoughts on the election results that we saw last week? Did they surprise you, or were they about what you expected?
Well, they were a little of both, but I would say generally they surprised me in this way. The popular vote distribution, we're still counting votes in California, but it looks like Republicans won about 52% of the popular vote overall. That's pretty much in line with what we expected. I gave a series of talks in which I sort of showed that 52% is probably the most likely outcome. But the question that I still don't have an answer for, and I'm curious to see your views, is when we convert that popular vote, 52% of the two-party vote, into seats, the Republicans fell a lot. They fell short of what I think we expected. So I was projecting, you'll recall in one of the early talks I gave, about a 28-seat gain for the Republicans in the House. It looks to me like they're going to get maybe 8 to 10-seat gain. That's a lot less than what I anticipated. And so I think the puzzling issue here, and I don't know if I have an answer yet, but I have some suspects, is why didn't the Republicans' popular vote margin convert into the seat margin in the ways that it has in the past?
Which is kind of interesting, because isn't that something that's been a bit of a puzzlement for Democrats, in that they've won popular vote totals, like in the presidential elections, for instance, but that hasn't translated into either legislative seats in state houses or in Congress. And I guess the finger is usually pointed at gerrymandering or whatever, or whatever, your districts being drawn in certain ways to favor one party or another. But usually, at least more recently anyhow, I've sort of heard that complaint more from Democrats, that, hey, we won the majority of the vote, but we wound up getting only, I think in Wisconsin is one state, I've heard that mentioned a lot, that the popular vote is not really reflective of the distribution of seats in their state legislature.
You're absolutely right. In fact, going into this election, I thought that same phenomenon would happen. And it typically is the Democrats who underperform their popular vote. And the reason they do that, we think one thing is gerrymandering, which you mentioned, and I'm going to get back to that because I think that's part of the explanation here. But the other is the inefficient distribution of Democratic voters relative to Republican voters. So you think about how many districts Democrats control, but they control with like an 80-20 split. You think about those very dense population areas in, urban areas where Democrats do so well. So they're wasting a lot of votes, whereas we think of Republicans as representing districts with, a 53-47 split favoring them. So they're not wasting as many votes. So that's the puzzle here. As you quite correctly point out, the expectation was the popular vote seat split would favor Republicans. They would get more seats than their popular vote. They did not. And I think, and I don't know this for certain, but I'm wondering whether coming out of the 2020 census and the gerrymandering that went on, that Republicans, they were so effective in some areas at gerrymandering that they overcompensated in a sense, and they are wasting votes here in some districts the way that we used to think Democrats did.
It seems like Democrats did better than expected in state legislatures legislatures across the country. And I guess I just wondered if you any thoughts as to why that happened?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. For instance, they picked up a couple governorships relative to the Republicans. So they're at what, a 24-26 disadvantage now, almost evenly split. I think one of the interesting results is that the swing voters in elections generally are the so-called independents. How independent they are is some debate among political scientists, but they're the ones that provide the volatility. We know Donald Trump's election in 2016 owed a lot to him winning independents by about 14% over Hillary Clinton. In 2020, Joe Biden won them back. He won by about 14% among independents. So heading into the midterm, I expected the independents to break for the Republicans. If exit polls are to be believed, they did not. In fact, the independents split evenly. So it's not that they overwhelmingly went for the Democrats. They did not. But it was almost as if they said, a pox on both your houses. We're just going to split the vote here. And in those toss-up races, I think that really hurt the Republicans. And I think that also explains how the Democrats did better down ballot in some of these states, winning those independents.
So we're talking today on Wednesday, the 16th of November. And last night, of course, President Trump announced he's planning to run for re-election again in 2024. So I guess I just wondered, first of all, what do you make of the timing of this announcement coming hot on the heels of an election where a lot of his handpicked candidates didn't fare so well in states like Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, three that come to mind, and well, we still have to wait and see what happens in Georgia. But I guess I just wondered, what do you make of the timing, and kind of to what extent do you think these election results we saw last week are some kind of statement from the independent, middle of the road voters that, gosh, it's really time to move on from the 2020 stolen election mantra and focus on our problems of today, and kind of get over it, Donald. And then secondly, does this create a problem for the GOP going forward into 2024, where they might have a division between the pro-Trump and sort of not so pro-Trump factions of the party?
Yeah, these are great questions. The timing, I think Trump locked himself into giving this talk in the assumption that coming out of the midterms, the Republicans would do a little bit better. The momentum would be there. He'd be able to claim some type of victory. And instead, as you point out, his hand-picked candidates did not do well. He's being heavily criticized, in fact, for backing weak Republican candidates, particularly in the Senate race. But I don't think he felt like he could just then change the date of the announcement. He had kind of locked himself in, and it would be a sign of weakness. The fact that he's running, I think, is an effort by him to clear the field very early, to establish the fact that he is in the race, and so the Republican Party should begin coalescing behind him. I don't believe they will. And so the real question going forward is, in contrast to 2016, where Trump caught them by surprise and they could not coordinate, the Republican Party establishment, behind an alternative, will they coordinate behind an alternative in 2024? That's what the question, I think, going forward for the Republican Party is. Right now, Ron DeSantis is trying to be that alternative, but there is definitely going to be a fight in the Republican Party for its soul going forward. Interestingly, I think we see this in Vermont, with Phil Scott just clearing the field in terms of running for governor. But down ballot, the Republican Party, it nominated a few Trump candidates with Gerald Malloy, Greg Thayer, and they just did not do well in Vermont. And I think this same type of dynamic is playing out in Congress. Think about the leadership challenges here to Mitch McConnell from Rick Scott, and Kevin McCarthy looks like he's going to be the speaker, but some grumbling about that from the House Freedom Caucus. So yeah, I think that's the issue. I think you've hit the nail on the head. The issue for the Republican Party is, whither our future. Who do we rally around? Trump is announcing early, hoping that it will be him. I'm not so sure.
Yeah, it seems like one would like to think there's a long way to go until the election day in 2024, but I guess it'll be here sooner than we think. But it does seem awfully early. But I think, yeah, clearing the field is clearly one part of the strategy. The other part I wonder about is this an attempt to preempt some of the investigations by the Department of Justice into, the documents he took with him to Mar-a-Lago when he left the White House in 2020, early 2021, and whatever other legal issues saying, well, this is a political vendetta against me by the Biden Justice Department.
I think the that could be a part of the calculation. If it is, I suspect it's going to be a very ineffective strategy. It's not going to prevent this investigation from moving forward. There's nothing in announcing his candidacy that somehow shields him from legal prosecution. It may, for a while, change the debate in media coverage of what's going on, but as soon as those investigations move forward and there's new news, if there is new news, those stories will be front and center again. He can't run from that.
Mm. Well, let's shift down to Vermont here. As you were mentioning that these national results have implications for the state situation here. What did you make of the votes here in Vermont? I mean, the big headlines, I guess, is that the Democrats now have a supermajority in the House of Representatives and in the state Senate. I think they picked up 4 or 5 seats, and if progressives and independents vote with them, they would be now in a position to block any vetoes that Governor Scott might want to issue in coming years on legislation. Does that, you think, change the dynamics much in the state house here in Montpelier?
Well, I think it potentially does. I think it depends on a couple of factors. How willing Phil Scott is to use his veto, even in cases in which, as we saw happen in the last working session here, even when he knows he'll be overridden, if he's willing to use that veto to stake out a policy position, how often that's going to happen. And on the other side, how often the Democratic leadership is going to whip their party and say, we need to override this veto. I think there is some concern that more moderate members of the Democratic Party don't necessarily always want to be put in the position of overriding a very popular governor, a governor whose popularity, as you well know, is stronger among Democrats than it is among Republicans. So, yeah, on paper, this gives the leverage to the Democrats. In practice, we'll have to see how it plays out on a vote-by-vote basis.
Yeah. Clean heat standard is one piece of legislation I'm going to be fascinated to see how that evolves in the new session, if it does. But I also wanted to return to a point you were making there a moment ago about, how Governor Scott was reelected by a smashing majority, clearly winning many votes among Democrats, and other candidates did not fare anywhere near as so well. Do you think that that's going to send a message of some sort to the Republican Party leadership that, okay, we can win elections when we're running candidates like Phil Scott or Jim Douglas or people like that, but we get into trouble when we kind of take the rightward swing that they seem to have taken this past year or so? Is that likely to kind of make an impression, or are they just going to say, oh, it's just 1 year?
One would hope it would make an impression, not just there, but again, returning to the midterm results nationally, I have to think the Republican Party is going to take a second look at some of these more extreme candidates that they ran. They had very winnable races in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, in Arizona, and you think about Arizona, Masters ran 17% below the average vote total for Republican candidates for the House in there. So I think if the Vermont party leadership is looking nationally for lessons, and at Phil Scott's, as you say, resounding victory, the lesson here is that type of Trumpification of the party doesn't play yet in Vermont, and we ought to yoke our party to Phil Scott's message here. Now, the question is, what was Phil Scott's message? I can't say this was an election that he won on his policies so much on. This was a vote for Phil Scott, the person, a civil, decent man, somebody who has steered us, as he would like to say, had a steady hand on the wheel through the COVID crisis, and developed a working sense of trust with the voters. But it wasn't, I don't think, a resounding victory for Phil Scott's agenda, because he didn't really push an agenda other than, hey, we got a bunch of federal money. We've made progress on issues like housing and broadband. So that, I think, puts the Republican leadership in a kind of a bit of a quandary, because what does the party stand for? In maybe low taxes, maybe I don't know, low taxes, basically.
Affordability, fiscal responsibility.
Yes, exactly. Sort of the buzzwords that don't necessarily translate into anything but, I want you to prevent the Democrats from charging the credit card and leaving the bill for a future generation. And maybe that's enough to be a Republican in the state of Vermont. I don't know. Certainly for a governor's position, but it seems hard to me to run as a legislative branch with a message that's devoid of policy pushing, other than we're going to just slow down progress.
Well, that seemed to be also mirrored on the national level, too, by the National Republican Party. I mean, I don't recall hearing a whole lot of policy prescriptions for, things like inflation or some of the other issues that were on the minds of voters. I mean, they were able to criticize a lot of things that the Biden administration was doing and what the Democratic Party wanted to do, but I don't recall hearing a whole lot of detailed policy messages from Republicans saying, well, if we're elected, this is what we would do to fix this problem.
I think that's right. I think you're absolutely right. The exit polls suggested that the economy, inflation, was the biggest issue for most voters, and the Republicans basically said Joe Biden is to be blamed for inflation, but they didn't necessarily say this is how we get out of it. I mean, the mantra seems to be cut government spending, give more money to individuals, and that will magically make inflation and things go away. I don't think most economists agree with that. But they're the opposition party now. So they're basically running an opposition to whatever it is the Democrats are doing.
So many questions here to get through. I find myself wondering, Kevin McCarthy, whom I assume is going to be named Speaker. I know there's been some talk of a few other people putting themselves forward, but he's going to have a majority of, 5 or 6 seats, something like that. Sounds like the worst of all possible worlds to me, where you're going to have, he's going to sort of be like, Chuck Schumer in the Senate. He can't afford to have a Joe Manchin equivalent in his caucus there. And it seems like the House Freedom Caucus, for instance, is going to be, that's 20, 30, 40 members. They're not necessarily going to fall into line automatically just because we want to support Kevin McCarthy.
Yeah, this is going to be the mirror image of what Nancy Pelosi dealt with the progressive wing of the Democrats. It's about 220 seats the Republicans are going to have, which is what the Democrats currently have. And you are absolutely right. I think the question is, can Kevin McCarthy deal with the House Freedom Caucus as adroitly as Nancy Pelosi did with the progressives? And one difference, I think, if you're a Republican, you're worried about, the House Freedom Caucus often seems to me willing to burn down the House for the sake of principle. And so you could anticipate on something like a debt limit vote coming up and them holding the entire party hostage in order to, roll back some of the Biden spending on infrastructure or something like this. So, yeah, I think it is. I would not want to be Kevin McCarthy, assuming he's the leader over the next 2 years. It remains to be seen whether he can be Pelosi-like in his handling of what could be a very rebellious wing of his party.
And just shifting to sort of the nearer term, we have I guess they used to be called lame duck sessions coming up with Congress. Two big issues seem to be on the agenda. You just mentioned one of them there, the debt ceiling limit, which I guess will need to be raised, and also this Electoral Count Act, which was like put in place 1887 in the wake of the presidential election was 1876 with Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden, and I don't go too deep down the historical rabbit hole here, but that came back into focus again in 2020, obviously with the close election, and suggesting that hey, it was time to update that to make it, eliminate some of the question marks in there. Do you think the remaining Democratic majority in the House and the 50-50 Senate will be able to pull off getting a debt ceiling raised and doing something about the Electoral Count Act?
I'm cautiously optimistic on the debt ceiling because I think neither party at this point, coming off this midterm, wants to risk a showdown in which they come out looking like obstructionists. So I think they will come to an agreement, and maybe a short-term agreement. The electoral vote count, I wonder if the inability of the Trump-backed election denier candidates, particularly for Secretary of State, none of them won these election deniers for these Secretary of State positions. I wonder if that blunts a little bit of the momentum, if there was momentum for this Electoral Count Act. It seems like the voters kind of rejected this more radical wing. I don't know, but I'm less optimistic that is going to pass. I suspect it's going to die in the Senate.
Do you think that'll be something that might come back in 2023 and before the new Congress and the new session?
You've got to overcome a filibuster on that. Unfortunately, that's the problem in the Senate. So I just don't know if they have the votes.
Mm. So in the time we have left, there's one other question I wanted to ask you for your takeaway on. On some of these close races in various states, the Democrats seem to be, and sometimes in a subtle way, and sometimes not, I guess, trying to help the most radical right candidate win. We saw this, I think, in New Hampshire with Dan Bolduc. There was another more moderate Republican candidate, Charles Morse, I think. He was a state representative.
Yeah.
We were concerned that he would be a much tougher opponent for Senator Maggie Hassan to defeat. And so they did some advertising that bolstered Mr. Bolduc. He won the Republican nomination and then went on to lose to Maggie Hassan. And this pattern, I think, repeated itself in a couple of other states. And it was also criticized, and I think reasonably so, as being a very cynical kind of approach and not really, and kind of risky as well.
Yes.
What happened? What would have happened if the bad guy, quote unquote, had won? In hindsight, do you think that since the strategy, the results seem to kind of go the way they were hoping, did that work, or was it just, should the takeaway be, well, we got away with that once, but, we better not try that again?
I talked to a Democratic strategist who's been involved in a lot of elections, and asked him about whether he felt a little squeamish about this party's embracing these candidates for the sake of sending the weakest one in. And he said, no, if it works, I'm all for it. Never mind principle here. The idea is to win elections and get candidates in office so they can push a Democratic agenda. Uh, I'm guessing they're going to take stock of where this worked, and if they collectively think it was effective, I think they're going to continue this strategy until it comes back and bites them. Now, a week and a half before the midterm, it looked like Bolduc had pulled even with Hassan, and so I think a lot of people were saying, "Oh, this strategy is backfiring." But then she won comfortably. So I think the bottom line for politicians in both parties is principles are fine in the abstract, but the reality is this is a fight to the death to win elections, and whatever works, I'm going to support it.
Interesting. And then finally, I just was wondering, a polling question here. Last couple of years, a lot of ink has been spilled, and well, I suppose I should get update to a lot of electrons have also been kind of, dispersed around the idea of that, the pollsters kind of weren't exactly spot on in some of their forecasts here. They were going back to 2016, you could say, 2018, 2020. And then this year, of course, there's the expectation of the red wave. That didn't happen. So what is going on with polling here? Why are we seeing this string of polling predictions that just turned out to be wrong? I mean, I realize it's, you're taking a guess here and everything like that, and there's a lot of factors that are making the techniques of polling different from what they were 10 years ago, let's say. Cell phones being one, I guess. But how did they do? Did you think the pollsters did better this time around than, let's say, in 2020?
I think they did. We haven't done the postmortem thoroughly yet, but I would divide the pollsters into two types. There were the traditional pollsters that I think did pretty well, at least in most of these major races. But near the end of the election cycle, there were a lot of Republican-sponsored pollsters that got in there, and I think they boosted the narrative that this might be a red wave because they were a little more optimistic about the Republicans' chances in a lot of these high-profile races. They turned out to be wrong, and those more traditional pollsters, I think, got it right when they said these races were going to be close, but the Democrats were going to pull them out. But as you point out, polling has just become more difficult for several reasons very quickly. You said one of them, cell phones. A lot of people don't answer their landline anymore. Response rates for polling is down to about 8%. It used to be up like 30. I think Republicans in particular are often not willing to talk to pollsters. And so that makes it really difficult to figure out what they're doing. So a lot of polling is done online now. And that's really difficult because rather than random telephone calls where you can get a representative sample, for an online poll, you got to get people to get online, and they're not necessarily representative. And so you really have to balance. You got to weight them to match them to what you think the real population is. And sometimes you get that wrong. In 2016 and 2020, a lot of pollsters underestimated the number of voters who did not have a high school education who were going to turn out and vote for Donald Trump. And that's why they underestimated his support in key states. So I think there's a lot of moving parts here, Andrew, that make polling questionable. But I think on the whole, the traditional pollsters did okay this past November.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but I'm sure we'll have another opportunity again to, dive into some of the nitty gritty here. And again, I thank you for your time, Professor Dickinson. Always a pleasure to have these conversations with you.
Oh, same. Likewise, Andrew. I look forward to doing it again in the future.